right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for attending today. My name is Chris Barrera, and I'll be moderating this session today, Understanding Gender Identity. I have almost 20 years of payroll and HR administration experience. This includes managing and directing human capital management systems, implementation and service, as well as business process outsourcing of end-to-end HR and payroll. I hold a certification from SHRM and HRCI, as well as a certification as a project management professional with PMI. I have over a decade of experience training HR and admin professionals in various webinars, conferences, and seminars. Today's webinar is good for one PDC for both HRCI and SHRM. We also recommend that you log into your portals regularly and add your PDCs with the approved activity number provided with your certificate. If you have any questions about recertification, please visit the SHRM or HRCI website, or you can contact me directly at chrisb@hubengage.com. All participants are recorded electronically and their total time participating is documented. Full participation is required. Each participant will receive both HRCI and SHRM certificates for attending with the required information, the activity ID for the CE credit. Well, just a little disclaimer today. This presentation is not legal advice, and it's not the final word on today's topic. As we'll go through the content today, we're really just touching the general characteristics of gender identity. It's a pretty complex topic, and there are many more terms and things to understand, but we'll be just doing a general understanding today. And then lastly, this is not a political opinion. So a little housekeeping for the webinar. You'll be muted throughout the presentation. If you have any questions or want to ask something, even if it's not yet open for open general questions, go ahead and write your questions down in the chat. That way we have an opportunity to read them at the end of the presentation and answer them for you. And that way also that you don't forget them. There's going to be a few poll questions. We ask that you please participate. And then, of course, we'll share the results with you. We chose today's topic in our continuing series of continuing education webinars because this is a topic that even if you think you understand, it's ever evolving and complex. This is no way intended to be a complete representation of gender identity. We only have an hour today to share general information that you might find helpful in the workplace. Many employers have responded to awareness of transgender workers by developing new policies aimed at the education of workers and implementing accommodations. But even though awareness has increased, the reality today for many transgender workers is that the path to getting a job, keeping it, and achieving the same career success as their cisgender counterparts remain fraught with obstacles. Employers should educate themselves and be aware of how to tackle these topics in the workplace. They should educate their workers, managers, and executives. They should understand the law and truly work on a culture that initiates an environment of diversity, equity, and inclusion. By the end of this webinar, you'll be able to explain the following. What is gender identity? We'll go through quite a few terms in gender terminology. We'll discuss the proper use of pronouns. We'll talk about understanding gender expression. We'll talk about gender identity in the law and best practices on gender identity in the workplace. So right now we're going to take our first poll. So let me get that set up. And as I get that set up, you can answer. And the poll is, what is gender identity? And you have 4 choices there. Please just tell me which one you think it is. All right, we'll give that a couple more seconds here. Yeah, so the correct answer is gender identity is the personal sense of one's own gender. Now, that's the definition. And I was thinking through the questions that I've written here, and gender identity is whatever you want it to be. That could actually possibly be correct as well, because that's exactly what it is. All right, thank you very much for participating. So understanding gender identity. The term gender identity was coined by psychiatry professor Robert J. Stoller in 1964 and popularized by psychologist John Money in the 1960s. Issues of equality and acceptance of transgender and non-binary people, along with the challenges to their rights, have become a major topic in the headlines. These issues can involve words and ideas and identities that are new to some. Oftentimes, we use these terms that are not necessarily interchangeable or mean the same thing. Here are a few terms that sometimes get thrown in with gender identity. They certainly work together, but are not necessarily the same thing. So let's start with sexual orientation. That is an inherent or immutable, enduring emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to other people. Note, an individual's sexual orientation is independent of their gender identity. Gender identity, one's most innermost concept of self as male, female, a blend of both or neither, how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. One's gender identity can be the same or different from their sex assigned at birth. Gender expression, an external appearance of one's gender identity, usually expressed through behavior, clothing, body characteristics, or voice, and which may or may not conform to socially defined behaviors and characteristics typically associated with either being masculine or female. And then lastly, transgender. This is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity or expression is different from cultural expressions based on the sex they were assigned at birth. Being transgender does not imply any specific sexual orientation. Therefore, transgender people may identify as straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc. One thing to note, languages change. Some of the terms now in common usage are different from those used in the past to describe similar ideas, identities, and experiences. Some people may continue to use terms that are less commonly used now to describe themselves, and some people may use different terms entirely. What's important here is recognizing and respecting people as individuals. According to the Williams Institute at UCLA Law, over 1.6 million adults ages 18 and older and youth ages 13 to 17 identify as transgender in the United States, or 0.6% of those ages 13 and older. Among US adults, 0.5%, about 1.3 million adults, identify as transgender. Among youth, 13 to 17 in the US, 1.4% identify as transgender. Of the 1.3 million adults who identify as transgender, 38.5, over 500,000, are transgender women. 35.9%, almost 500,000, are transgender men. And then 25.6%, almost a third, report that they are gender non-conforming. So I felt it important today to go through some gender terminology. And again, this is can be complex, and there are many, many terms. There are many new terms. There are some terms that are still being used. So I really felt it was important to spend some time going through these definitions so that you have a understanding of gender terminology. And actually, during research of this presentation, there were some things that I still learned. So, again, this is an ever-evolving landscape, and we should be up to date and keep up to date on the terms that are being used. According to the Human Rights Campaign, many Americans refrain from talking about sexual orientation and gender identity or expression because it feels taboo or because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. Today, we'll be covering a complex list of terms that are used in determining gender identity. So the first one, the term ally, and that one seems pretty easy, right? It sounds like allied, and that's exactly what it is. A person who is not LGBTQ, but shows support for LGBTQ people and promotes equality in a variety of ways. Androgynes. The term is identifying or presenting as neither distinguishably masculine or nor feminine. Asexual. This term means the lack of sexual attraction or desire to other people. Biphobia. This is a prejudice or fear directed toward bisexual people. Bisexual. This is a person emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to more than one sex, gender, or gender identity, though not necessarily simultaneously, in the same way, or to the same degree. Cisgender, a term used to describe a person's whose gender identities align with those typically associated with the sex assigned to them at birth. And this is a relatively new term, and you may have already started to see it in certain, applications, and sometimes they'll use the term cisgender male or cisgender female, and that's just a new term to identify your gender identity. Closeted describes an LGBTQ person who has not disclosed their sexual orientation or gender identity. Coming out. This process is in which a person first acknowledges, accepts, and appreciates their sexual orientation or gender identity and begins to share it with others. And then gay, a person who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to members of the same gender. Gender expression, we mentioned this earlier in the presentation. Gender expression is the general appearance of one's gender identity, but it's usually expressed through behavior, clothing, haircut, or voice, and which may or may not conform to socially defined behaviors and characteristics typically associated with either being masculine or feminine. Gender fluid. According to the Oxford Dictionary, a person who does not identify with a single fixed gender or relating to a person having or expressing a fluid or unfixed gender identity. Gender dysphoria. Clinically significant distress caused when a person's assigned birth gender is not the same as the one in which they identify. According to the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the term, which replaces gender identity disorder, is intended to better characterize the experiences of affected children, adolescents, and adults. Gender expansive conveys a wider, more flexible range of gender identity and or expression that typically is associated with the binary gender system. Gender nonconforming. A broad term referring to people who do not behave in a way that conforms to the traditional expectation of their gender, or whose gender expression does not fit neatly into a category. Genderqueer. Genderqueer people typically reject notions of static categories of gender and embrace a fluidity of gender identity, and often, though not always, sexual orientation. People who identify as genderqueer may see themselves as being both male and female, neither male nor female, or as falling completely outside of these categories. Gender transition. This is the process by which some people strive to more closely align with their internal knowledge of gender with its outward appearance. Some people socially transition, whereas they might begin dressing, using names and pronouns, and or be socially recognized as another gender. Others undergo physical transitions in which they modify their bodies through medical intervention. Homophobia, the fear and or discomfort with people who are attracted to other members of the same sex. Intersex. This is an umbrella term used to describe a wide range of natural bodily variations. In some cases, these traits are visible at birth, and in others, they're not apparent until puberty. Some chromosomal variations of this type may not be physically apparent at all. All right, we're almost getting to the end of the list. Again, there are quite a few here. Lesbian. Most of us have heard that term and recognize it. A woman who is emotionally or romantically, sexually attracted to another person. LGBTQ. This is an acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. Living openly. Okay, this is a state in which LGBTQ people are comfortable out about their sexual orientation or gender identity, where and when it feels appropriate to them. Non-binary. This is an adjective describing a person who does not identify exclusively as a man or a woman. Non-binary people may identify as being both a man and a woman, somewhere in between, or as falling completely outside of these categories. While many also identify as transgender, not all non-binary people do. Outing. This is exposing someone's lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender identity to others without their permission. Outing someone can have serious repercussions on employment, economic stability, personal safety, or religious or family situations. Pansexual. This describes someone who has the potential for emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to people of any gender, though not necessarily simultaneously in the same way or to the same degree. And then the term queer, a term people often use to express fluid identities and orientations, often used interchangeably with LGBTQ. All right, here's the last of them, I promise. Questioning. Questioning is a term used to describe people who are in the process of exploring their sexual orientation or gender identity. Same gender loving, a term some prefer to use instead of lesbian, gay, or bisexual to express attraction to and to love people of the same gender. Sex assigned at birth. The sex, male or female, given to a child at birth, most often based on the child's external anatomy. This is also referred to as assigned sex at birth. And then the last one, transphobia. This is a fear or discomfort with transgender people. Now, you can find a full list of these sexual orientations and gender identities on the Human Rights Campaign website, hrc.org. And I've also included a list of these references at the very end of the presentation. And you'll notice these numbers here that are used to, they were used to quote the data that was here and also for your reference to be able to get to that material later, should you have questions or want to look it up on your own. Gender, so understanding gender expression. Gender expression is how you choose to express your gender identity through your name, pronouns, clothing, hairstyle, behavior, voice, or body features. We talked about this before. Gender expression also includes using facilities like bathrooms and change rooms that match up with your own sense of gender. Society often thinks of these cues as being male, masculine, or female, feminine. But what's thought to be masculine and female changes over time and within different cultures. Gender expression is a bit different than gender identity. If gender identity is how we think of ourselves internally, gender expression is how we display this to the world. Gender expression refers to things that we choose to display. Now, this is different than simply the idea of gender. Remember that gender refers to the culturally assigned characteristics or beliefs. And while we might not always agree with the gender assigned to us and the characteristics expected of us, gender expression is our own voice, our own choice rather, than something imposed on us. All right, so now let's talk about the proper use of pronouns. And today I'm just giving you a general use of common pronouns that are being used. I have seen some websites and resources that have up to 76 different type of pronouns. But here I'm just covering for the sake of time today, just covering the main gender pronouns. So first of all, what is a pronoun? A pronoun is a word that people use to either refer to themselves, such as me and you, or to someone or something, like she, it, them, and this. Gender pronouns, like ze, them, he, and she, are used specifically to refer to people. Gender pronouns are the pronouns that people choose to use for references to themselves. So for example, if Kelly's preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers, you could say that Kelly ate her food because she was hungry. Some gender pronouns are neutral, them, they, and theirs, and some are not, she and he. And some of them have been created as an alternative to or rejection of gender binary. There are also lots of other pronouns in use, some of them more general, some of them more gender neutral. Here are a few that you might hear. They, them, and theirs. She ate their food because they were hungry. This is a pretty common gender neutral pronoun and can be used also in the singular. Z, here, and here. HIR is pronounced as here, HRE. Tyler ate here food because Z was hungry. Z is pronounced like Z and can also be spelled ZIE or XE. And this replaces she, he, and they. Here is pronounced like here and replaces her, hers, him, his, they, and theirs. Okay. And the last one, sometimes it's just easier to refer to people by name, and that's not wrong. Okay. Ash ate Ash's food because Ash was hungry. Some people prefer not to use pronouns at all, using their name as a pronoun instead. Everyone has a right to use gender pronouns that match their personal identity. These pronouns may or may not match their gender expression, how the person dresses or behaves or looks. Purposefully misgendering, using the wrong pronouns, and ignoring the pronouns in use is also an offensive and disrespectful to trans and gender nonconforming individuals. So what is a proper way? Let's talk about a little bit about the proper use of pronouns. What is the right way to find out a person's pronouns? Start by giving your own, for example. My pronouns are she and her. If I was introducing myself to someone, I could say, I'm Chris. I use him pronouns. What about you? When should you ask someone about their pronouns? Knowing each other's pronouns helps you be sure to have accurate information about another person. How a person appears in terms of gender expression doesn't indicate anything about their gender identity. And while it can be awkward at first, it quickly can become routine. For cisgender people, sharing their pronoun is generally pretty easy so long as they recognize that they have pronouns and what they are. For others, it can be more difficult to share their pronouns in places where they don't know people. But there is still benefit in sharing pronouns. It's an indication that you understand gender expression does not equal gender identity. Now, but you're not judging people just based on the way they look and making assumptions about their gender beyond what you actually know about them. The practice of stating one's pronouns at the bottom of an email or during introductions at a meeting can also relieve some headaches for people whose first names are less common or more gender ambiguous. And in best practices here, we'll talk a little bit more about what you can do as an organization, what you can do as individuals to help bridge that gap and help make people feel more comfortable about sharing their pronouns. What if I make a mistake and use the wrong word or term? So if you mess up some language and you just say, oh, I'm sorry, correct yourself and move forward. No need to make it a big, complicated, more complicated than that. Doing that really is a simple gesture of apologizing quickly and moving on, shows the other person that you care and that it does make a really big difference. Why might someone's name be different than what's on their ID? The process of changing a name can be very complicated and expensive. It's not like changing your name for marriage. Just because a transgender person doesn't have their authentic name on their ID doesn't mean it's not the same and that they really don't use it every day. So just be mindful to refer to people by the name they really choose, regardless of their driver's license. And as an HR professional, you would be coming across this information probably during the onboarding process, when you're processing documents, notice a change. So look for those cues. Many systems today, HR systems, allow you to put preferred names. Payroll systems allow you to put preferred names. So it should be a pretty easy transition and be able to help capture the right information for those individuals. All right, gender identity and the law. Bostock versus Clayton County. In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled in Bostock versus Clayton County that discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity constitutes discrimination because of sex in violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. On January 20th, 2021, President Biden reaffirmed and applied those protections by issuing an executive order on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Boxton versus Clayton County affirmed that an employer who fires an individual merely for being gay or transgender violates Title VII's prohibition against sex discrimination. Previously, prohibitions on sexual orientation or gender identity were limited to state and local laws. So gender identity in the law. Here is what the Department of Labor says on discrimination, including harassment based on gender identity or expression, is sex discrimination. The department's policy reaffirms DOL's commitment to fair treatment of and equal opportunity for all people. Policies prohibiting discrimination based on transgender status, gender identity, or gender expression create the reasonable expectation of an environment where all employees and applicants for employment are evaluated by their performance rather than by their gender identity or expression or other perceptions thereof. In 2020, the Supreme Court in Bostock versus Clayton County affirmed this interpretation, cementing protections for transgender and non-binary workers. Studies have shown that transgender and non-binary people face disproportionate amounts of discrimination in all areas of life, notably in employment. A 2015 study by the National Center for Transgender Equality indicated that 77% of transgender respondents who had a job in the preceding year reporting taking steps to avoid mistreatment at work, such as hiding their gender transition at work or quitting their job. In the same study, nearly half, 47%, said that they did not ask their employer to refer to them with correct pronouns, such as he, she, or their, out of fear of discrimination. Non-binary respondents, 66%, were nearly twice as likely to avoid asking to be referred by the correct pronouns compared to transgender men and women. These statistics underscore the importance of the department's creating a safe environment for all employees. And here's what the EEOC says about sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. They have a term for this, SOGI. The law forbids sexual orientation and gender identity description when it comes to any aspect of employment, including hiring, firing, paid job assignments, promotions, layoffs, trainings, fringe benefits, and any other term of condition of employment. It is unlawful to subject an employee to workplace harassment that creates a hostile work environment based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Harassment can include, for example, offensive or derogatory remarks about sexual orientation. So this is a complicated landscape. I included this chart in here, and I've included a reference for you there to access it. And there are 20 states and Washington, D.C. have laws that explicitly prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's really, just a little less than half. The Equal Opportunity Employment Commission has a growing number of federal courts. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and a growing number of federal courts have extended protections to include sexual orientation and gender identity, specifically through Title VII's prohibition and discrimination on sex. So, as we work through these policies and these understandings in our own organization, the state that you're in will also have or could have specific rules that you should include in your policy. So I've included that as a reference for you. All right, so just another quick poll here. Okay, and is it illegal to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity? So yeah, absolutely, it is illegal. Just based on what we heard from the Department of Labor, EEOC, and the executive order that was signed in 2021. Again, these rules are ever evolving and changing. Many other states will be promoting legislation to incorporate that. So keep up to date and look at those as you incorporate those within your organization. Okay. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about gender identity and best practices. Open the door for conversation. Ultimately, it's going to be up to each individual whether or not they choose to share their transition experience with the workplace. While some people may choose to discuss their gender identity with coworkers and supervisors alike, some employees may find this to be a strictly personal matter. The best way to accommodate both scenarios is to normalize the concept of varying gender identities within the workplace. This can be done through very small gestures, like encouraging employees to include preferred pronouns in workplace correspondence, like email signatures. And many applications today have a way for you to add your preferred pronouns in your profile or your avatar. I have had pronouns in all my applications that I can, so that when I interact with people, I let them understand that it's okay to share those pronouns and that I'm sensitive to that. So for instance, most of us use LinkedIn. LinkedIn have had preferred pronouns for a while. I've activated that on LinkedIn. Slack, I had them activated on Slack, and I have them activated on Zoom. And even if they don't have a place specifically for listing a pronoun, you can include them very much like you do any certifications or a title, or include them in your title. So that's what I've done in my email signatures, is I've put in my preferred pronouns as he, him, and his. You've seen through the presentation, those are changing, and we're moving from he, him, and his to he and him. And I think those will continue to evolve. But it's letting people know that it's okay to talk about that. Now, additionally, employers should host sensitivity training exercises for all employees to become better acquainted with gender identity terminology and anti-discriminatory guidelines. Supervisors should also work to create an open channel of communication with employees so that individuals feel safe discussing workplace issues associated with gender identity. So for instance, in my workplace, we have specific training on gender identity. We have specific training on the proper use of pronouns. We have specific training on diversity, inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a part of gender identity, making it an inviting place for all people, not just for gender identity, but for race and cultures, religions. And it really helps break down those barriers. So if you don't have that training, we do online training. So we're not necessarily holding classes. It's easy to deploy, and it's easy to get people to recognize that there is training for that, and then also check it off that they've attended that training. Same thing applies to policies. Your policy should be very clear. You probably already have harassment policies and sexual harassment policies and other hostile work environment type. So be sure to include these policies in there as well too, so that employees and everyone know what's prohibited and what's not allowed, and what you'll have zero tolerance for. So gender identity and the restroom. The subject of bathrooms is probably one of the most controversial facing gender identity and transgender individuals. Employers should make strong non-discrimination policy with direct reference to gender identity. Within this policy, accommodations can be made for personal spaces like bathrooms, should be outlined in those policies. To be considered of a person's gender identity, they will likely desire to use the restroom of their respective identity, whether or not that conforms with sex identified at birth. Employees should feel safe knowing that they are welcome to use the restroom in a space they define, whether that be male, female, or gender neutral. If possible, employers can make gender neutral bathroom options available for transgender or non-gender conforming individuals. And we've already begun to see that, just in the landscape, where there used to be family bathrooms, and now they've turned into non-gender specific bathrooms. So the world is changing, but these are still really big concerns, and they can be very controversial for your employees. I've actually placed a couple of links from OSHA and other state agencies in the reference section for you. So if that is something that you need to address, many people have gone remote now and continue to stay remote. So that, certainly is something that, you may have to include in your policy if you still have workplaces, or if you have people occasionally still do a hybrid schedule. All right, so we are at the end of our seminar. All right, well, thank you all for attending. We appreciate your time, and we hope you find this information helpful. If you have information or you want a copy of this presentation, please reach out to me, Chris B. at hubengage.com. All participants who attended today will receive a certificate, regardless of your affiliation with SHRM and HRCI. We thank you for your time. Have a great rest of your week.